something which has won more awards than any other podcast in Aotearoa. It's now in its 9th season. I am, of course, talking about RNZ's very own Black Sheep. It is hosted and produced by William Ray, exploring New Zealand history through real-life, shady, controversial and sometimes downright villainous characters. Increasingly, it typecasts me once again in the new series. I have become typecast as a murderous Scot on it. But, like so many people, I'm a huge fan of Black Sheep, and I actually can't believe it's been 9 seasons. I asked William, how's that happened?
I mean, I just keep doing it, I guess. It's crazy. I only just realised when I look back, and I was like, I've been doing this 10 years.
Yeah.
I sort of was like, I feel like I was a producer on 9 to Noon like 2 years ago, but I've been doing this 10 years now. I tell myself every season, it's like, oh, this will be the last one. There can't be any more. And then I sort of do a bit of research. Like, oh no, there's renewable resource of terrible people in New Zealand history.
There you go. What is in store for people this particular time round?
Well, we're kicking off with Elspeth Kerr. She was a Devonport nurse who was totally beloved in the local community. She actually rescued a couple of firefighters who were involved in a car crash. But in the 1930s, they discovered she was a serial poisoner. She had poisoned her husband, her foster daughter, and potentially quite a lot of her patients. They never found out exactly how many, but in 1992 they discovered bones on the grounds of her old nursing home, and they were never able to quite pin it to her, but I mean it was buried around the right times from an 80-year-old woman who they're never able to identify. But it's a very spooky story.
Because she'd run a nursing home, I suppose you'd call it now, residential care. This
was sort of quite common back in the day, where quite often nurses did not have like official nursing qualifications, but they'd have some experience. Like Elspeth Kerr had been a nurse during the First World War. And so they'd open up their own house and offer care for usually the elderly or expectant mothers. And so she did that and was, very well liked in the Devonport community. And there was complete shock when it turned out that she'd been poisoning a whole bunch of people.
It's a fascinating story certainly around her husband and her foster daughter, but tell us a little bit about how this was all discovered. You mentioned the bones at the property in Devonport, but how were they found?
So those bones were found when they demolished the old house, and there was a guy who was digging the foundations to build a new sort of big mansion thing there. And I talked to him, the guy who did the digging. His name is Simon Gundry, and he said they were just digging away through this. He described the soil very fondly, so it's nice sandy soil, good days digging, and then just a skull fell out of the hole, and apparently the guy digging the hole just went white in a second, and then they called in the cops and found out all about Nurse Kerr. So it was a big shock for them. They still remember it strongly.
Pretty creepy stuff. Elspeth Kerr, so she's the first of your... It's in 2 episodes, that particular story, isn't it? Who else is coming up? What are your other favourites?
After Elspeth Kerr, we're doing Elsden Best, who listeners might know is a very famous anthropologist. He wrote the book Tuhoi, Children of the Mist, which is still in print, actually. I found him maybe more difficult to wrap my head around than anyone else we've ever done on Black Sheep, because here's this guy who is absolutely fascinated by Māori culture, but in a way which is totally inexplicable from a modern perspective, I think, because he has these sort of, classic 19th century racist views. He believes that Māori are inferior to Europeans in all sorts of ways. He participated personally in the Parihaka raid. He was actually there on the ground. He was sort of part of this movement that came about after Charles Darwin, which was sort of trying to turn anthropology away from the sort of the missionaries who'd done the work before, who had sort of a biblical interpretation of Māori, which is that they were, a lost tribe of Israel, and they'd sort of fallen and degraded from some, height in the Garden of Eden, and instead was saying, well, no, these are people who have their own indigenous culture to them. They're not just some offshoot of Jewish culture, I guess. And it's just getting inside the heads of these people is so difficult from a modern perspective, because you're talking about a guy who spent 10 years living in Te Urawera, all this time writing and talking to rangatira and taking down their words. And then he writes this stuff which you're just like, in one breath, it's sort of this fascinating, really deep, really nuanced, like writing about some aspect of whakapapa or of history. And then the next line, it's sort of like, and of course, the Māori are not as good in hard work as the Europeans because it is not a feature of the lower races. And it's sort of just that clash is so hard to unpick, which is probably why it's such a long episode, that one. I think.
Well, this is the thing, because for you, when were you sort of first bitten by the history bug and get interested in all of this nuance and story?
I got into history through podcasts because I didn't take history at high school. If I had, I think I would have really enjoyed it. But I was just the classic, history is boring. And then I started listening to sort of in my, early mid-20s history podcasts. And I was like, these are great, like Dan Carlin's Hardcore History and some YouTube history show. Extra History was really good. I really liked that one. And I just found myself looking around like, there must be something about New Zealand history. And there just wasn't at the time. So when RNZ was setting up the podcast unit, I pitched the idea of I'll interview a bunch of historians and just gone from there. It's been not the line of work I expected to get into, but it's been fascinating. I've really enjoyed it.
And the villains of history. In fact, it was going to be called Villains originally, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was terrible.
Well, working titles are always bad.
That was the working title, yeah. And then my executive producer, Tim Watkin, was in a taxi and he was chatting with the taxi driver about a project. He was like, we're doing this podcast about, controversial characters of New Zealand history. We don't know what to call it. And the guy said, they're like the black sheep of New Zealand history. And Tim was like, yep, we'll take that.
Yep. I think that's actually in the first episode.
Yeah, it is.
I'm enough of a nerd. I've actually listened to them all. How do you select them, though? Because, as you say, there are many, many people who, are littering up New Zealand and indeed history of other parts of the world. What is it about the villains that makes them so fascinating to you?
I mean, villain stories are always interesting, right? Because they have inherent conflict at the centre of them. They're also interesting because a lot of them are maybe slightly misunderstood, or it's interesting to find out what their motivation was to do things that we would now understand as being, terrible and horrific. And some of them are out-and-out criminals. And those are the ones I tend to find slightly less interesting in some ways. Like it's fun to write them as sort of like a true crime thriller type thing, like Elspeth Kerr. But people like Elsdon Best I almost find more interesting because it's sort of like, here is a person who is not a psychopath, who is not a sociopath, who was thought of in their time as a totally respectable person and even a very admirable person. And what was it about their time and what was going on in their world which made them behave in the way they did that we might not understand totally from our perspective? I mean, people like George Grey are like that. The one my favourite episode we ever did was Horatio Gordon-Robley.
I've got that written down.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you most memorable, or who's the one that you sort of continue to find yourself thinking about? Which one do you still find fascinating? And I found Horatio Robley, the headhunter, I found him absolutely gripping. Because
it starts off with this photo, it's Robley and he's holding a greenstone meteor in one hand, and next to him is his collection of, I think it's like 45 mokomokai, tattooed Māori heads. And you see that and you think, this guy is a monster. He must be a monster. He's got, the waxed British moustache. He looks like the sort of like very worst thing you could possibly imagine of a colonist. But then you find out he has this just astonishing life story where he is present at Pukehinahina, the Battle of Gate Pa, and he draws what he sees in the aftermath of that battle, and it's almost like Vietnam War photography where it is so gripping and so confronting to people back in the UK that it actually helps shift public opinion against the New Zealand wars. He returns back to the UK after actually having a child with a local Māori woman, and is still completely fascinated by Māori art forms, and particularly moko, facial tattoo, and devotes much of the rest of his life to collecting these mokomokai because he's just so fascinated about this art art form. And his book, which he wrote on the subject, is I think still used by some traditional moko artists because it has like really detailed drawings and I mean, he doesn't really understand the significance of the patterns, but his understanding of the art form is really interesting. I just found him so strange and fascinating. And his Māori descendants are still around in the Bay of Plenty. I talked to them. It was really, really interesting. They had sort of this difficult relationship with him where for a long time there was a lot of, whakamā, a lot of shame associated with the link to him. And his son, I think, even like threw his book to the ground and stamped on it and, didn't want anything to do with him. But his sort of more recent descendants, since he's become a little bit more rehabilitated, have a bit more of a positive view of him. But I just found him so, so fascinating. Just one of those people are so tricky to understand through a modern lens. Yeah.
They are mostly about individuals.
Yeah.
But there is one that immediately springs to mind for me, which is not about a person, but on a character, I suppose, of another kind. You did one on white supremacy after the Christchurch mosque attack.
Yeah.
Why did you want to trace that history through Black Sheep, which is normally so sort of character-driven?
I didn't hear about the mosque attacks until I think it was 3 days after the fact, because my now wife and I were on a hike and outside of all of Connection, we sort of came back to this, horrible news. And one thing I saw everyone saying is, this is not us, which is obviously, great sentiment and largely true. But I just couldn't help thinking, geez, I've spent the last 5 years or whatever it is at this point looking at terrible people, and including the one which has the most parallels to what happened in Christchurch was Lionel Terry, who was a white supremacist who travelled the length of the country distributing anti-Chinese propaganda and then shot and killed a man here in Wellington, an elderly Chinese man. Shot him completely unprovoked and then turned himself into the police and said, I've done this to bring attention to, the threat of Chinese migration to New Zealand. That guy got a lot of public support from New Zealanders at the time, which was, early 1900s, I think it was. So it's just sort of a little reminder of, no, this is not us, but it's not something that is totally alien to New Zealand.
Mm. Aside from Black Sheep, you've produced an awful lot of other content for RNZ. A lot of podcasts. Kelly Charlton's Final Treasure Hunt and Nellie's Baby being some of the more recent ones. Also, of course, the Aotearoa History Show.
Yeah.
Which I think is still being used in schools.
That's
pretty cool, eh?
It is. I still never watched it. I can listen to myself. I can't bear to see myself on camera. It was really funny. My mum had a bunch of I have a stepsister who's like 15 years old, and all of her mates were around, and they rang me up and they were like, "Oh, is this William Ray to the Aotearoa show?" That was really cool. That was for me. That was sort of for my past self a bit, because I came out of high school thinking that the Treaty of Waitangi had been signed at the end of the New Zealand Wars as sort of like a Treaty of Versailles kind of thing, which is obviously not true, and not something I just wanted to stress for my social studies teacher, not something that I was taught. It was just an assumption that I'd come to, and I just had this really strong feeling that like we learn history in like bits and pieces, but what is really helpful is to have it all threaded together in a narrative, and it doesn't have to be super overwhelmingly dense tome-like kind of thing. You just need the little framework so that when you do go off and learn other bits, you can fit and go, oh yeah, that happened, during the Gold Rush era, or that happened, around the time of the Second World War, and I know vaguely these other things are happening. I just thought that was a cool thing for New Zealand kids to have. If they want to go off deeper in future, that's awesome, but also here's some basic stuff just to let you know. And I still think that the episode which we did in the second season on the Native Land Court is probably the piece of work I'm most proud of. Yeah, it's such a boring subject, but at the same time so important and so horrific in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Thanks for the opportunity to be, typecast as a Scottish murderer.
That was the role you were born to play.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. You're too kind.
Yeah.
William Ray there, the brains behind RNZ's Black Sheep, and of course you can listen to that wherever you get your podcasts, or indeed at rnz.co.nz.
Discover a legacy of excellence in the heart of Washington, D.C. At the Catholic University of America, where more than 130 years of graduate education meet innovation and purpose. Choose from over 100 graduate programs, including business, engineering, nursing, and public policy, all led by world-class faculty. Gain the skills, connections, and confidence to lead in your field. It's time to elevate your future. Learn more at catholic.edu/graduate.